Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, welcome to Capel ASMR. That's Capel. And today we have another relaxing reading. We are continuing Oriental Girls Desire Romance, a novel by Catherine Liu, published in 1997. You can listen to chapter 1 here or here. And let's just jump right into it. This is chapter 2. And chapter 2 is called Monday Part 2. Caught in the middle of Wigstock, Brian and I looked around, bedeviled by the press of people. The performances were nearly over when we saw Tom, a handsome young man we both knew for different reasons, standing near us. He had recently been one of the pretty young faces featured in interview magazines as filler between articles on real celebrities. The captions to these romantic black and white photographs promised imminent fame and fortune. James X, painter on the fast track. Tina Y, the new girl about town. Mark Z, dancer leaping into the limelight. But these promises rarely came true. Something had gone wrong with Tom's career, and the disco fantasy of fame and success that had seemed just around the corner when the article first appeared a few months before now seemed to be receding. Tom was very proud of the stock from which he came, and I think he assumed that he was going to carry on in the tradition of his blue-blooded ancestors by establishing himself in the disco aristocracy of a new era. He was one of the very last sons of an old New York family, a beautiful and effeminate boy who had some not very coherent ambitions about getting ahead by being beautiful and effeminate. When we knew him, he was still sharing a tenement apartment in the East Village, unable to afford better real estate. He was suffering from the whiplash of glamorous downward mobility. After the interview piece on him, it had looked for a fleeting moment as if he was going to be the new Eddie Sedgwick. But now he wasn't even on the Wigstock program. How fickle this fame thing was. How dangerous. How closely it pressed against us, yet how distant a possibility it actually was. He said, "Oh hi." We said, "Hi." We chatted aimlessly, and he tried to impress us by denigrating the girls who had organized the day's events. "Oh my God, these queens are so tired," he said. I said I didn't think they were tired. I thought they were great. I was devoted to them. I said that I loved Happy. He said, "Oh, she's all right, but she's too messy. This whole thing is a mess." Then he looked around and said that he wanted to get out of this neighborhood, this ghetto. He said it just like that. He said ghetto. "That's what it is," he said. "A ghetto of widows and poor people," making a sweeping diva gesture with one long arm. He declared quite grandiosely, "Oh, I can't stand all these poor people. Les pauvres. Don't know if that's the right French, but his French sounded like it was learned from multiple viewings of Les Miserables. Les Miserables? Brian and I looked around, hoping that no one was paying attention to us. We were embarrassed for him. As he talked, his eyes kept darting around, scanning the crowd for other people he knew. Tom liked us. We were amusing, but we weren't exactly the most glamorous duo in the park that afternoon. He rushed off finally in search of worthier interlocutors, waving a hasty goodbye. Later, during the winter, when I was really suffering over Bruno and desperate for any kind of distraction, I bumped into Tom on the street in the East Village. He accosted me with an exaggerated warmth that I responded to immediately. His larger-than-life emotions provided me with a fleeting illusion of intimacy and warmth and goodwill, So when he told me in great detail about how he had nearly died from a gas leak in his apartment, I felt compelled to offer more than just verbal support. He had ended up in the hospital for severe gas poisoning. They didn't want to take him at St. Vincent's because he didn't have health insurance, but luckily his Upper East Side dowager of a grandmother had come to the rescue at the last minute. Only after she had signed something promising to pay his bill had he been admitted. Now he couldn't go back to his gas chamber apartment. He had been staying with friends. He was desperate. Could he stay with me for just a night or two? Tom played the damsel in distress and looked every bit the part. I said yes and brought him home to the tiny ground floor East Village apartment where I lived. He slept on the couch in our living room. My roommate was surprised by Tom, but he was entertaining at first and he cooked. He was loud and boisterous if he got any attention at all, and sad and pathetic if he was left alone for too long. He had absolutely nothing to do with himself when left to his own devices, so he had taken to making hats out of scraps of fabric. He occupied himself in this way when I wasn't around. He had no money, but he cooked us dinner every night with provisions I bought, and he tried to entertain us with his chatter. The apartment was cramped and could barely contain him because he talked very loudly. After the third day, I told him he had to go. My roommate had had enough. He was crestfallen that he had to leave. He pouted and pleaded, but I insisted. It wasn't my apartment. My roommate was fed up. There was absolutely nothing I could do. I had no choice. On the fourth day, he finally left, and I never saw him again. I just remember him standing on St. Mark's and Avenue A, still waving his hands and shouting about les pavors. After the last act of Wigstock, Brian and I had dinner at the Odessa coffee shop. When we got our check, Brian suddenly said he had to go home. He was a moody boy. He often withdrew like this, abruptly and without warning from our day-long forays around town. He would go home to read 19th century novels and refuse to answer the phone. He was the kind of student who had always did his homework. I was the kind who didn't, but pretended I had. His studiousness frightened me. When he was prepared to make his retreat, his face would take on a closed look, and I knew there was nothing I could do to persuade him to stay out and keep me company. Brian loved conspiratorial relationships that excluded the world at large. I think reading allowed him to conspire with books. We said goodbye, but I had nowhere else to go, and it was still early. The weather was beautiful. It was a holiday, after all, but I didn't really understand what holidays were for. I walked home slowly. When I got through the door of my apartment, I looked for the answering machine, and luckily the little red light was on and blinking. I pressed play, and there was a message from Bruno. I wasn't thinking much about him because he was nothing to me yet. Not an object of desire, nothing. Just an adventure, an experience to file away. Our bathroom encounter had been a strange and incomprehensible interlude. I remember my indifference to him vividly, but if he hadn't called, my indifference would probably have evolved into something else. He left a message saying he was home. Why don't I give him a call? I thought, why not? It was something to do, something to get me out of the house, someone to see. That was all I wanted. I called him back and he answered right away as if he had been sitting by the phone, waiting. He said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Nothing." He said, "How about a coffee?" I said, "Okay, where? How about my neighborhood?" He said, "Sure." We named a place and he hung up. Then Karen called. In school, Karen and Honey Me had been my best friends, but then we graduated. Karen went to Paris with Honey Me, and when they came back, things were just not the same between us. I was surprised that Karen was even calling. Honey Me had been completely cold to me, and I found that Karen strayed very little outside Honey Me's spheres of influence. I agreed to see Karen despite the fact that it was difficult for me to find anything to say to her. She said, "How are you, girl?" And I said, "I'm okay." She said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm having coffee with someone. I'll call you when I'm done. Maybe I'll go downtown and see you." I was intensely nostalgic for the way things had been between me and my friends. I missed the illusory camaraderie that we had shared, and I found it difficult to accept that things had changed as much as they had between us. I was suspicious of Karen and angry at Anime. It was only much later, after the bitterness that had poisoned all our interactions had done its work, that I realized why I had begun to resent them with such ferocity. They were not the richest girls at school, but they were certainly richer than me. They always had enough money for exotic trips to South America and Europe and Africa, where they each took multiple lovers and smoked cigarettes. They wanted to make movies, most of the times about themselves. Their appetite for self-representation was insatiable. I was jealous of their trips and half convinced of their genius. I met Bruno at the cafe. He was 20 minutes late. He was on Italian time. There was something shifty and nervous about him. He looked compulsively and wolfishly at every woman who walked by. I thought, what a creep. He said, "How are you?" I said, "Okay." He skirmished around a few of my attempts at small talk, then started lecturing me about literature. He said, "You know, I've been thinking about compassion. Remember when we started talking about this at the party?" We had done more than talk about compassion, but I didn't bat an eyelash. I nodded. He gave me a look, but didn't give me a chance to answer. He continued, "You know, in Proust," and then he looked at me again to see if I was taking it all in, if I was following, and I looked bright-eyed as if I were, and he went on, "I've been thinking that Swan's love for Odette becomes compassion in the end," he said. "Finally, after he marries her, his passion for her has become compassion." I told him I didn't agree. He replied, "Oh, how would you understand about compassion? You are too young. You are basically American. Even though you are Chinese, compassion is not something you would understand. If you go to Italy, you will see everywhere the image of the Madonna and Child. And when you see that, you will understand compassion. Compassion. To feel with." He tried to aestheticize the compassion, but in those days, there was very little talk of compassion in my life at all. It was not a quality I had ever thought of cultivating. The only time I allowed myself to feel sad was when I was watching Eyes on the Prize. I thought Bruno was arrogant, and I disliked his con man airs, but it was strange how eager I was to revise my first impression of people. I wanted them to be precisely the things they weren't. I wanted Bruno to be a man of honor, a man of the people, a real writer and intellectual, and I wanted him to be someone who would love me and care about me all at the same time. When he told me he had published an essay in an irregular, hip little journal of contemporary theory, I said, "Oh, where can I get a copy?" He said that it was so long ago it isn't worth reading, really, rolling all his R's, but I was impressed with anyone who managed to write anything for any public, no matter how small. In fact, I believe that the smaller one's public, the greater one's integrity. I was thrilled by this new piece of information and found his essay at the library the following week. Physically, he wasn't my type at all. He was handsome, but too thick. Even his skin seemed thick. He was too male, heavy-set and broad-shouldered. I liked men who were more sexually ambiguous, to the point of girlish effeminacy. A big man with a hard-on seemed redundant to me. I was bored by the fact that he was parading his erudition before me. When he said, "I've been thinking about Hamlet," I was puzzled by this new turn in conversation. I thought it was quite a leap. In fact, his talk about Hamlet had everything to do with his talk about Proust. In both cases, he did not stop boasting in some way about his thinking, his literary sensitivity, his grasp of theory. I was finding him more and more intriguing. The only people I had ever met who talked about literature and literary theory were hopelessly academic, completely cut off from life of the city, terribly sincere and provincial. Bruno, however, seemed like a real denizen of the urban, a literature man of the world. He went on, I've been thinking about how everyone has gotten it wrong. You know, Hamlet was ambivalent and this prevented him from having compassion. He shifted his heavy body around in his chair and waved his hands around to emphasize the points he was making. Since there was no possibility of actually engaging in dialogue with a man who was involved with boasting as a form of seduction, I listened to him. I was being taken in so deeply by his display of knowledge and street smarts that I was able to ignore all the signs of brutal narcissism that allowed him to be cruel, manipulative, and entirely dishonest in relationships with women. Finally, he asked what I did with my time, and I said, "Oh, I never go out. I'm the Emily Dickinson of 7th Street." I was trying to represent my sense of isolation as a kind of self-imposed reclusion. He said, "I don't believe you." "It's true," I said. "I'm speaking metaphorically." He said, "So let's get out of here. Let's see whether Emily Dickinson of 7th Street lives." I said, "Oh, it's a mess." He said, "It doesn't matter. Come on." And he grabbed the check nervously like someone who was going to try to get away with not paying. When I made a gesture to get my wallet, he said violently, No, I pay." I said, "Okay, thanks." I took him to the apartment where I lived and showed him my room. There was a bed, a big bookcase filled with books from my days as an undergraduate, and a desk with a computer on it. He said, "Oh," gave the room a cursory look and closed the door behind us. He grabbed me, kissed me hard, and pushed me down on the bed. I was very inexperienced, very frightened. I hardly enjoyed sex at all, although I pretended that I did. He wasn't rough, and I was sensationalistic because I was afraid of my fear. I went 6 months without my period. Bruno left me, and I went to the doctor, and she asked me, "Why didn't you come to see me sooner?" She thought I was pregnant. I had nothing to say to her. It seemed like a ridiculous idea to me. How could I have conceived a child on this desert island, on the broken glass of the land of my exile? I told her I had always been irregular. I didn't think of myself as being the kind of person who got pregnant. She asked what kind of birth control I had been using. I lied and said a diaphragm. She said, "We had better give you the test just in case," and all I could think of was that I didn't have enough money to pay for this visit, much less the tests. I knew I was sterile, I knew it. Pregnancy was not the problem. Anything more serious than pregnancy never even occurred to me. It hadn't really sunk in that a relationship like the one I had with Bruno could have been more than just physically painful. It could have been fatal. Once, Bruno told me that children were one of the greatest pleasures in life, but by that time I was furious at him, and I said flippantly, "What would you know about children? About pleasure?" He laughed at my sharpness. Later I did wonder what he could know about compassion, about Swan's love for a debt. In the beginning I had thought that in him I had discovered a real writer. I felt so bad that he had to do hack journalism in order to make money to live. I wanted him to write things like that little essay he had published in the hip little theory mag. I read it and thought it was beautiful. I was heartbroken for his inability to write anything longer, to do work he was passionate about. I wished that he didn't have to curry favor with Italian television in order to make a living. He had become a romantic, revolutionary, literary hero in my eyes. In real life, all he could talk about was how he couldn't love anyone. I had adopted him as my very own personal lost cause, however, and I threw myself into the project with the fervor of the self-deluded. With the doctor, I acted as if everything was fine. I didn't tell her I didn't have any money. I said I'd take the test. I didn't tell her I felt the world was denying me something that I wanted badly, that this was the real cause of my ailment. I didn't tell her that I felt as if I had only been given peeks at what life could be, that I had always stood outside the scenes of pleasure, banished to a state of numbed paralysis while others lived and enjoyed things I didn't even know existed. I didn't tell her that I wanted to stretch my cramped limbs which had been tortured into folding in upon themselves. I didn't say that when they unfolded I wanted them to be wings. I wanted to fly over the ruins of this city like a great deranged bird, gliding over the tops of the bare branched trees of this square park to a place where, finally, I would be able to find rest. And I never told her how much I wanted revenge. I wanted all the love and recognition I had been deprived of, and I wanted everything right away. No one knew what I could be. No one had seen me before. I was a completely new species of being, but there was no hope of my ever being discovered. I was desperate and impatient. I didn't say any of these things. I tried to give up on the idea of being a writer, although at times I found myself writing feverishly, very late, when I couldn't sleep after a night out on the town, or else I scribbled things down on Sundays when I was lonely and bored, on rainy evenings when I didn't feel like doing any of the required reading for my graduate courses. I would write, always in longhand, and I never reread what I put down. Inspiration came to me unexpectedly and abandoned me just as abruptly. I was beginning to see more and more books published by people I had been at school with. Some had even scaled the heights of the New York Times bestseller list. I wondered what was wrong with me that I had not produced anything, not even one piece of writing I liked, while my classmates were penning stories and getting them published in places like the New Yorker. I hated myself for being so ambitious and so incompetent. Being ambitious made me miserable. How could I escape my laziness, my utter lack of talent? My lack of industry struck me as a congenital disease. Choosing a career in letters, wanting to devote myself to literature, this was my fatal mistake, a first step toward decadence and ignominy. Don't know that word. Since the beginning of this century, the brightest young Chinese scholars had devoted themselves to more pragmatic subjects, medicine, mathematics, and the hard sciences. Before that, the Chinese had been too steeped in matters literary. As the Western world rushed into the arms of industrialization, the Chinese had malingered in an opium-induced fantasy. If I had been good and true, I would have devoted myself to some other field of study in order to win back the lost honor of my backward country of origin. I thought that because I had turned my back on such worthy pursuits, I suffered from a kind of regressive narcotic indolence. I was completely out of sync with the puritanical rhythms of modernity and efficiency. To distract myself for a while, I suffered for Bruno. I endured his meanness and his cruelty. I thought he was the writer. He was the one who had had his work published, who had seen his name in print. When I was still seeing him, he used to tell me mockingly in all sorts of ways, and with a kind of libertine pride, "No one can say that the promises I made you have not been kept, because I didn't make any. We signed no contract." I tried to stay with his derisive tone, but I began to falter. I was angry, and I told myself I didn't care about him at all. I wanted to tell him to shut up. I wanted to say that I didn't want to hear his pretentious, stupid lies. I wished he was dead. He thought he was so intelligent, so sophisticated, telling me about Proust's L'Indifferent as a way of letting me know about his own incurable indifference. But it was the dumbest, most transparent disavowal I had ever heard. I tried to console myself with the thought that I was smarter than he'd ever be. He was a puffed up windbag, a philosophical gigolo. I never said any of this to him. What eventually did come out of my mouth was certainly not pretty, however. I think I told him that I hated him, but I never said how much or why. I was asking for something from him, and he had heard me loud and clear. It was a very dangerous thing for a girl, a young woman, to ask for something without realizing what it was, but that was what I did. And even though he gave me what I had asked for, to be mistreated and abandoned, he also reminded me that I had no rights over him. Yes, it was a paradoxical situation. He told me that my despair had nothing to do with him, and he was right. He had made the rules and defined the game. I had broken the rules by asking for anything at all, so I tried to ask for nothing, but that nothing contained within it everything I felt was missing from my life. I was looking for a false prophet. I wanted a teacher, a master. I thought Bruno could teach me things I wanted to know. The more hooked I was on his attention, the more he withheld it. In the beginning, when I was more or less indifferent to him, he called me, he initiated plans. Like a dealer, however, he began to despise me for my dependency on his stuff. He started to exact a higher and higher price for what I began to crave, and I couldn't seem to get away from him. After China, after being alone for so long in the city, after being unable to touch anyone or anything, I was willing to pay almost any price for even a fleeting, abbreviated feeling of contact. That was my high, and I needed my fix. Sex seemed like hope to me in those days. Sex seemed like everything. Back on 7th Street, Labor Day weekend, it was almost midday when Bruno finally left. He got dressed in the dark and he was talking about something cultural, intellectual, art, historical again. I think it was Giotto's Blue. When I saw him to the door, he said, "I'll call you." I said, "Okay, sure." And I smiled and said, "Good night." I closed the door. After he left, I called Karen. Brian had said he would call, but I knew not to count on him. I told Karen that I would meet her at a bar in Soho in half an hour and hung up. It was almost 1 a.m. In Soho, I could catch glimpses of unimaginable beings swimming as if underwater through the limpid medium of well-lit lofts. I could see them buying fruit late at night for their breakfasts the next morning. Their clothes were well cut and expensive, but always worn casually. They had families, but many of them looked like artists. They seemed so comfortable in their skins. They attended each other's openings. They lived in big, open spaces. They ground their own coffee. They were invited to dinner parties. They gave dinner parties. They socialized. Later I found out that they went to the country on weekends during the summer months and had barbecues with their city friends out at the beach and in the mountains. I thought it would be impossible to penetrate this luminous world. I didn't know the magic words. Open sesame. Karen drawled a "Hello girl, how are you?" as I walked into the bar and we sat down at a table in the back room. I was feeling a little high from having fucked Bruno, but I just said I was fine. I didn't know if I would tell Karen about what I had just done. Karen had been on the wagon for 2 years now, so she had watched me drink my drink and she ordered food. She felt that I hadn't been supportive enough of her during the time she quit drinking, a fact that Honeymee told me accusingly one day. The two of them had obviously spent a great deal of time criticizing me behind my back, yet I continued to call them out of habit. I wished everything could be the same again, that we could all be friends like we had been before, but I only felt more and more distant from them. I decided to tell Karen about Bruno and the previous week's party because I thought she would find my story amusing, but she didn't react at all. She was distracted and absent and could hardly give it enough attention to comment on it. In the midst of my narrative, I sensed her lack of interest and lost the thread of conversation. I almost stopped talking mid-sentence. She said suddenly, "I can't sleep anymore, at all. Do you know what it's like to not be able to sleep? I've got to go to work at 9 a.m. these days too." I said, "Do you mean you don't sleep at all?" "I sleep about an hour or two, sometimes 3. "What's happening with that guy you're seeing?" "Which one?" "The impotent one." She laughed. First he was trying to get me and Honey to sleep with him at the same time. Then he started to focus on me. "Is he totally impotent?" "How am I supposed to know?" she snapped. "We've never gotten very far. You know, it's one of those things. He's very romantic. I think he's kind of in love with me. Last night he wanted to stay over, but I said no. He's cute though. Have you ever seen him? Used to be a black belt before his accident, but you should see his house. It's completely furnished, the kind of stuff you can buy on 14th Street. You know, those clocks with the painted sunsets inside them, paintings on black velvet. He's rich too. I think he's a millionaire, but he's so stupid about his money. He works like a dog in that stupid store with his brother 12 hours a day, and he owns 3 buildings downtown. You've got to teach him how to spend his money," I said, trying to focus my attention on what she was saying, even though I was just angry at her. She was not interested in anybody but herself, and she wanted very much to make her life sound bizarre and impressive. "How did he get rich?" I asked. She shrugged it off as if it was a stupid question. "I don't know," she said dismissively. I would have liked to press her on the details, but I didn't. She told me abruptly that she'd been writing. "Really?" I could barely conceal the hostility in my voice. I didn't want her to write if I couldn't. I should have been writing that very second I was out talking to her. I'd been writing for years, but I never announced it to anyone the way she and Honey would announce it to me. "We've been writing," they told me. They were writing screenplays. They were going to collaborate on a project based on characters modelled after themselves. Karen continued, "You know this film that Honey and I worked on in Paris? I've started working on it again. I'm thinking of getting this guy to back it." "You should really try to do that. That would be great," I said as Karen ordered another cup of coffee. No wonder she couldn't sleep. I looked at Karen and I didn't know who she was anymore. When she and Honey got back from Paris, they seemed harder than ever. It took my breath away to listen to their stories of life among the denizens of Parisian nightlife. It sounded so idyllic. Getting up late, strong coffee in the morning, shopping, reading, bathing, picking up the dry cleaning, eating, then waiting until it was late enough to go out, staying out until early morning. The most important decisions of the day were what to wear and where to meet. With their newfound Parisian chic and sophistication, they also seemed to have acquired endless secrets and inside jokes that they enjoyed telling right in front of me. If I asked about the name just dropped during the courses of a conversation, they acted impatient and cold. Once when I was in their house, they left me alone in the living room, went into one of the bedrooms and whispered behind the closed door for about 15 minutes. When they came back into the kitchen, they were still laughing. If I had been capable of compassion, if I hadn't been so lost myself, I would have noticed how lost and frightened and lonely Karen was in this city. But in order to have compassion for Karen, I would have to have compassion for myself, and as it was, I was a bit challenged in this department of my emotional life. That muscle was missing from my psychic anatomy. There was only one situation during those years when I was what people might have called moved. Was it compassion that I was feeling? I don't know. But the civil rights movement was, for me, more edifying than any biblical drama, more familiar and more moving, though what I learned and what I experienced there seemed to have no application in my everyday life. Karen and Anime liked being messy and a little bit mean. They enjoyed having impossible relationships with men who had spectacular sexual dysfunctions. They liked to live down and out lives, and they could afford to be so cavalier because their families were generous with them. Neither of them could ever quite admit to receiving money from their families to live the lives of decadent bohemians, and both of them worked occasionally when the money dried up. But the truth of the matter was that they had more money from their families than I had from mine. It was as simple as that. They went to Paris to become idle, bad girl dandies and meet exotic men who would marry and support them. Sugar daddy was a big term then. I went to Beijing to teach English because I knew that I could at least get a round-trip plane ticket from my father to do so. I knew he would make good on that promise because it would look good to his Chinese colleagues that his daughter was going to China after college. While waiting for something to happen in my life in order to kill time, I played this running crap game with myself. I tried to see how many free meals I could get each week out of the men who were interested in sleeping with me. I didn't do so badly sometimes. It was a wholly go lightly period. I wanted to go lightly, and I didn't know that I was following the footsteps of many worthy predecessors, young women like me with small means of the big city. I was still hungry all the time. One day, weeks after the girl Bruno was waiting for had arrived, I went to dinner on the Upper West Side with a guy named Michael something. I can no longer remember his last name. We went to a trendy Italian restaurant. He had lamb. I ordered black fettuccine with a sauce of scallops and haricots. We had a salad of organically grown California baby greens topped with heated goat cheese. For dessert, he had a tart with pine nuts, and I ordered profiteroles that came bathed in a bittersweet chocolate sauce. Michael told me about pine nuts, how they were eaten in Italy, how they don't really exist here in the United States. I told him that the Chinese cooked with pine nuts as well, and he seemed surprised and genuinely interested in how they were used in Chinese cuisine. He told me about the black tie opening he had gone to the night before. He told me about Harry Cipriani's in Venice, about Carpaccio, how it was melt in your mouth delicious. As he talked, a whole new world of possibilities opened up before me. A world of wealth and ease and good food. I started to relax into my chair. At first I had assumed that Michael was gay, that he just wanted to be friends, but I was wrong. I wondered why he was buying me dinner. Did he just want to see my face light up in a dazzling smile of delight as he told me about the Carpaccio at Harry Cipriani's? What had made him take an interest in me? What did he want from me? We talked about his job because it seemed like his favorite topic of conversation. He couldn't concentrate on anything but his ambition, his success. I was interested in this kind of ambition. He was in the art world. I was interested in art. I encouraged him to continue talking. He told me about how his grandmother took his brother and him to a spa every year in the winter. He laughed at her idiosyncratic habits. I tried to be appreciative, but I could only think about how wonderful it must be to have such a sophisticated and wealthy grandmother. How could the world have denied me the advantage of a prosperous family? How could I ever think that I would be able to surmount the difficulties of being a writer? My ambitions seemed ridiculous, yet I brooded about how I could possibly give them up without regrets. After this brief digression, he continued to speak about his career. The art market was doing very, very well. He had started making deals while still an undergraduate, and now he was escorting famous European painters to exclusive clubs. He wore designer suits and made wealthy old ladies feel comfortable with their purchasing power. He said people aren't serious about what they're doing. They don't understand that you have to be serious. I'm serious. People who aren't serious don't survive very long here. I don't understand how anyone in the city can live without direction or commitment. I always wondered what people like that are doing in this town. This city is about work, it's about commitment to working. It's a joke to live in the city without any direction. It is not the place for that kind of existence. I agreed with everything he said because I was hypnotized by the airlessness and the dogmatism of his manner, and I hated arguing with men. Besides, there was some strange truth in what he was saying, and he was selling art left and right. He was gentlemanly and discreet. He was well on his way to becoming successful. He was successful, and so young. I went to bed with him and discovered that he had no idea what it was to be with another human being sexually. It suited me fine at the time because I didn't either. I thought I had known once, but I was wrong. I went to bed with him out of sheer perversity. He was sweet in the little old man sort of way, and he was strangely paternal with me. Over dessert, he continued, "My ex-girlfriend is now somewhere in India. She just left New York one day. She had had enough, and I think India is actually where she really belongs. She fell in love with some guy who was going there, and she decided to go along with him. Can you believe that? She was completely lost. She just walked out of her life. Her job, her friends, I never realized it. But the problem with our relationship was that she never knew what she wanted." At this point of the conversation, I found that I could barely open my left eye. I excused myself just as he was explaining to me how and when their relationship had ended. I headed for the peach-colored bathroom, my head down. When I got there, I looked in the mirror and pulled my eye open for a better view, but I couldn't see anything on the cornea. I felt a sharp stabbing sensation. My left eye was crying, but only my left eye. It was a funny feeling. I looked up and down, and then I finally found a piece of dirt in the blood-colored pocket below the eyeball. I dabbed at the dark spot with my finger, removing it. Back at the table, I said to Michael I had something in my eye. He said, "Oh, I see, your eye is all red. Are you all right? Maybe we should get you some eye drops?" He seemed scared, slightly horrified even. He acted as if I had told him I had leprosy, but he was the gentleman and tried as hard as he could to remain polite. I said it was all right now. It was just a piece of dirt and I'm all right. When I got home, there was no message on my machine. Bruno hadn't called. Why should he have? I had said it was over, but for a moment I found it difficult to breathe. I changed, picked up the phone and dialed Bruno's number. I hung up without putting the receiver to my ear. I dialed Bruno's number again before I had a chance to stop myself. When his machine came on, I slammed the receiver onto the cradle. Right before things seemed to get really bad between us, Bruno told me that I reminded him of Lizette in Bataille's The Blue of Noon. I got angry and said, "Why her?" I wasn't sure why I was angry, because I had forgotten almost everything about Lizette except that she was ugly and dirty and a virgin and wore glasses. One day I took the book with me, a subway reading on a trip to a lunch date I had made with a man whose name I have completely forgotten. I remember vividly what I ate though. I had smoked chicken salad with wild mushrooms and arugula soaked in warm olive oil. This man walked me to the subway and I tried to avoid making another date with him right there and then. I said to him, "I'll call you." On the train on the way home, I began to read the passages about Lizette that I have translated here. I know Bataille would understand the liberties I took with his text. During the most unhappy period of my life, I used to see this woman who I was attracted to only because she reminded me of one of those birds of unhappiness, as opposed to a bird of paradise, a bird who brought bad news. was a bird of ominous but portent, with whom there was no shadow of sexual attraction. I was sick, very sick, but this girl didn't notice anything. I tried to see the bird of unhappiness as often as possible, but I would have these fits of exasperation with her. I used to see her at this bar/restaurant behind the stock exchange. I made her eat with me. We had a hard time finishing a meal. She was 25, ugly and really dirty. The women I had been with in the past were, on the contrary, always well-dressed and very pretty. Her family name, Lazare, suited her macabre appearance more than her first name. She was bizarre and even ridiculous. It's hard for me to explain the interest I had taken in her. All I can say is I was completely deranged, completely out of my mind. That's what all my friends at the stock exchange thought anyway. She was the only person at the time who would help me escape from everything collapsing around me. She appeared in the doorway of the bar, looking like a carcass, silhouetted in black against the entrance. In this place of chance and fortune, she was a stupid aberration of bad luck. She was all in black. Her clothes were ill-fitting and covered with unidentifiable stains. She looked like she couldn't see anything in front of her face, and she was constantly knocking into tables. Her hair stuck out every which way like crow's wings on each side of her face. Her nose stuck out from between those ghastly wings and emerged from under steel-rimmed glasses. She made people uncomfortable because she always talked so loudly and so serenely as if everything was foreign and strange to her. Suffering, pain, anguish, disease, death were nothing in her eyes. She assumed that everyone else was like her, too. She thought that everyone lived in the most calm and clear indifference. She was fascinating as much for her lucidity as for her thinking. When she was thinking, it was like she was hallucinating. She defended the principles of a communism that was completely different from the official communism of Moscow. Sometimes I thought she was completely insane, and that if it was a sick joke on my part to be pretending to participate in her sick games. I saw her, I think, because her agitation was as intense, as unbalanced, as tortured, and as sterile as my private life. What fascinated me the most about her was the morbid enthusiasm with which she threw herself into sacrificing her life and blood for the cause of this disenfranchised. I thought, the thin blood of a dirty virgin. The image of Lazare was like a trap for me. It was like a maze from which I could not escape. The harder I tried, the more deeply lost I became in it. Lazare was a fanatic virgin. Was that what I was then? Lazare was a slightly distorted portrait of Simone Weil. Did I walk around in the world possessed by that kind of madness? To what cause was I going to sacrifice my femininity, my youth, my beauty that I was so unwilling and unable to acknowledge? Bruno always said to me, you could really be a beautiful girl if you dressed right. Somehow I must have appeared to him like a slightly crazed ascetic, an intelligent, dirty, ugly woman who lived in a vapor of intense mysticism. It was hard to say why anyone stayed around anyone else. It was impossible to say why my heart broke at the end of the movie when the Amish woman and the honest cop didn't live happily ever after in an aura of perfect romantic consummation. I wanted the two of them to have just a few more minutes together. I knew full well it wouldn't work, wouldn't last, not even until tomorrow, but they were torn from each other and then it was over. The movie was over and I was left wondering if a little time was too much to ask for. In those days I felt as if I could have just gone out into the city and walked and walked and walked and walked straight out of Manhattan. I wanted to disappear and never come back, never feel like I had to, but I was afraid I would simply fall down in despair before reaching the end of the world. When I went to China, I thought I was performing a nifty disappearing act from the Western world. I thought I could lose myself by walking off the edge of a cliff. Things were bad, and it would probably not be inaccurate to say that I needed help. Help, however, was not in the offing. I realized I couldn't say any of the things I was thinking or feeling to my so-called friend Karen. I merely recounted to her that I had seen a downtown celebrity of sorts on the streets where I lived, and we discussed his tastes for Asian women in rather desultory fashion. I had wanted to follow him, to ask him where he was going. I had wanted him to take me with him, or because he had looked at me in the eye with an unfaltering, intelligent gaze. I felt that my world was too small for an image to take on flesh and appear on the street where I lived and look straight at me. Suddenly, Karen and I both realized how late it was. As we left the table, it felt as if we had just awoken from a dream. On my way home, I said to myself, this is it now. This is absolutely the end. Everyone else you know has gone to bed. It was a long walk home, but I didn't count the minutes it took to get from the Bowery to Avenue A. I saw someone I knew and smiled weakly at him. He paused, thinking I was going to stop and ask what he was doing because he was good looking and young and it was very late, but I kept walking. It was as if I floated right by him. My footsteps were light, each one getting lighter and lighter until I was ready to stop walking altogether and start coasting up the street to land on my doorstep with a soft thud. I fumbled like I always did, searching my torn pocket for my keys. It was nighttime now when each garbage can rustled softly as I walked by. It was late, but not late enough when you were up like I was up. And that is the end of chapter 2. Chapter 3 will be the last chapter I read of this book, and then I hope it has intrigued you enough to go on and find your own copy. I'm liking it so far. It's very slice of life, and it uses a lot of words I don't know, and so I feel like my brain expands in that point, and I too want to be a writer, and I too don't write often, so my story's being told, and I'm not as flippant with my courting as she is, but it's fun to read someone who's slightly different to you, but also slightly the same. Anyways, if you're still awake, if you're still here, thank you for watching, thank you for listening. I hope you're well, and I will see you in the next video.